I am the Philosophical Bachelor, and today I'm going to talk about Schelling on free will. Friedrich Wilhelm Joseph Schelling proposes a metaphysical theory to account for human free will in his Freedom essay. Published in 1809, the essay is more formally known as Philosophical Investigations into the Essence of Human Freedom and Matters Connected Therewith. He asserts that the concept of freedom is central to any metaphysical system. A concept is not what it is the concept of. The concept of freedom is not freedom itself, but he is saying that the question of freedom is critical to metaphysics. It needs to be settled even if that metaphysical system settles it by denying freedom. Materialism, for instance, denies free will because it posits an ineluctable chain of cause and effect, leaving no role for freedom. It also seems that any philosophy that posits absolute unity also leaves no room for free will. Or does it? Schelling's basic argument for human free will is simple. He has one major premise. Like is recognized by like, a law hailing from ancient times, which he hence does not rehearse the arguments for. He then makes an observation. We can to some extent understand the divine. If we can recognize the divine, we must have some resemblance to it based on the premise. Since we have an ability to understand the divine must also be in us. It follows then that since God has freedom, we must likewise possess freedom. His theory is pietistic, drawing on the belief in God, though this is not a flaw. Precisely because of his religious belief, he will attempt to resolve the problem of free will in relation to the problem of evil, both of which trouble theology. Pantheism is a doctrine identifying God with all of nature. The pantheism that Schelling draws on is the pantheistic theory of Benedictus de Spinoza. Spinoza concludes that in a pantheistic world, there is no free will, but as Schelling will argue, pantheism can allow for free will. Since Schelling's theory may be construed to be pantheistic, he examines the arguments where pantheism seems to be against freedom. 1. Pantheism as a unity of constituents in the absolute. If the constituents have no freedom because of pantheistic unity, this cannot be a true identity since God remains free. In an identity, the constituents should also be free. If the constituents are not free, then they are lifeless, which implies that the unity is also lifeless, since it is made of lifeless parts. Since that is not the case, meaning some of the constituents are alive and free, the unity hence must be a creative unity, created by its free and independent constituents. The constituents depend on the ground which comes from God, but just because they were begotten from this ground does not mean they cannot develop their own independence. The son of a man is also himself a man, writes Schelling. Just because a child depends on his parents for his existence does not mean that he does not become his own independent person. 2. Pantheism as a whole composed of parts. Schelling further argues the independence of the constituents. A part is a part insofar as it is part of a whole, but this does not mean it has no freedom. For example, the eye is part of the body, but has its own freedom apart from the demands of the whole. It is capable of being diseased, which is counter to the desire of the whole. 3. Argument against mechanism or determinism. Schelling writes, God is not a God of the dead, but of the living. It is incomprehensible how the most perfect being, could find pleasure even in the most perfect machine possible, whereby the product is nothing for itself. The procession of things from God is a self-revelation of God. But God can only reveal himself to himself in what is like him, in free beings acting on their own. As a perfect being, God will not create a world where things are all dead. Instead, he will want to create a world where there are things similar to him, alive and possessing freedom. Schelling notes that Spinoza is a fatalist not because of his pantheism, but because he is a determinist, treating beings in the world as mere things. On the contrary, Schelling thinks that everything real, that is, nature and the world of things, has activity, life, and freedom as its ground. By freedom, Schelling is referring to free will. He writes, "Freedom is the capacity for good and evil. This means that for freedom to exist, evil must also exist, since if there is no choice to do wrong but only right, then there is no genuine freedom. However, the existence of evil requires explanation." The problem of evil poses a major difficulty for theists. The classical formulation of the problem is how a perfect God can allow evil to exist. Specific to pantheism, since everything is immanent in God, then evil must be within him also. Even if one accepts that God is not the cause of evil, the question of why he permits it still needs answering. Schelling reviews a few major approaches to ameliorate the problem of evil, though these are not his preferred solution. 1. The positive element of evil is good insofar as it is positive. Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz argues that evil leads to higher order goods. For instance, without poverty, there can be no charity. But if so, then where is the evil in what we have called evil? This view can lead to moral ambiguity, since evil is in fact good in the final analysis. 2. Denial of the reality of evil. Evil is merely what is less perfect. In nature, there is no evil. 3. Manichaean dualism, with good and evil as two forces that are fundamental in the universe. But how can the arising of the opposing principle and estrangement from God be explained, since it will require his permission? 4. Neoplatonic conception of matter. Plotinus explains that the further we descend from the source of all emanation, which he calls the One, the less perfect things are, finally bringing us to formless matter, which, since it is devoid of form, cannot be good, and hence necessarily evil. Schelling argues that freedom comes from God, but since freedom requires the existence of evil, then either freedom cannot come from God, or the root or ground of evil must be independent of God. Schelling's aim is to come up with a theory for nature and freedom based on idealism that is a living realism based on a living ground. By realism, Schelling means materialism. By idealism, he means that reality is mind-dependent. He tells us that realism must be the ground and medium in which idealism makes itself real and takes on flesh and blood to achieve a true philosophy of nature. He adds, idealism is the soul of philosophy. Realism is the body. Only both together can constitute a living whole. Underlying his theory is the distinction Schelling makes between God and the ground of his existence. The ground is nature. This ground is in God but is not God. Yet Schelling tells us it is incorrect to think that the ground precedes God. Instead, all things mutually presuppose each other. No thing is another thing, and yet no thing is not without another thing, he writes. Schelling thinks that the concept of immanence, where everything is in God, needs to be shelved. Instead, the concept of becoming better captures nature. Since all things are different from God, they cannot become what they are in God, but instead become in the same ground that God came to be, which is nature. We now see rule, order, and form, but initially there was anarchy that had been brought to order. This anarchy is still in the ground. The understanding is born in the genuine sense from that which is without understanding, adds Schelling. From chaos comes order, and from unconsciousness comes consciousness. Darkness is part of the ground, and from the same ground is also light, though God is all light, since he completely conquered the darkness in the ground. Not for the other beings though. Without this preceding darkness, creatures have no reality. Darkness is their necessary inheritance, writes Schelling. It is our awareness of darkness that drives us to strive for the light. These two principles of darkness and light are in all things, but find its fullest expression in human beings, where their selfhood is raised to spirit, also known as personality. Animals, according to this idea, have selfhood, but not consciousness, not spirit, not personality. This spirit in a person raises him above the level of creature. Spirit is not merely beholden to the will within nature the way the animals cannot subvert their instincts without perishing. Spirit transcends nature, rising above the principles of light and darkness, good and evil. Schelling rejects theories which speak of evil as a lack or a privation, since only man, the most complete of all visible creatures, is capable of evil. The devil, according to the Christian point of view, was not the most limited creature, but rather the least limited one. The ground of evil must lie, therefore, in that which is most positive in what nature contains, in the revealed centrum or primal will of the first ground. To have the capacity for good and evil, one must already have consciousness, possessing a sufficient capability to even understand that a particular deed is evil or good. A lion eating a calf is not evil, it is simply its nature rooted in its instinct. But a human being killing or tormenting another human being is different not merely in degree but in kind, where this killing is not for nutritional purposes but malice. Where can such evil come from? Schelling believes it is from the primordial ground, the ground where everything originates. Evil does not come solely from human sensuality or our animal nature, because that will mean that it can be completely conquered through our use of reason. Human beings have reason, but we still have evil. If it is just our basic animal nature, then we are passively evil, the way we will not term acts by animals as evil since we do not grant them the intellect or freedom to have free will. Since evil is real, Schelling thinks it must be something necessary for the revelation of God. He writes, "For if God as spirit is the inseverable unity of both principles of light and darkness, and this same unity is only real in the spirit of man, then if the principles were just as indissoluble in him as in God, man would not be distinguishable from God at all. He would disappear in God, and there would be no revelation and motility of love. For every essence can only reveal itself in its opposite." God as absolute being contains all in union, with the union of the two principles complete, and hence is not two separated principles for him. For human beings, both principles are possible, and hence we are confronted with this duality in our choices. Schelling tells us that personality is founded on the connection between a self-determining being and a basis independent of him. This applies to any conscious being, human beings, but also God. God himself requires a ground so that he can exist, asserts Schelling. By exist, Schelling means to become a spirited being, since God as being was already there eternally. This ground is within God as already explained, but yet the ground is different from God with its own nature. God is the purest love, and this love has its own will, which is different from the will of the ground. The will of love cannot eliminate the will of the ground, since if it does so, it also will eliminate itself, since it must also come from the ground. For the ground must be active, so that love may exist, and it must be active independently of love, so that love may really exist, Schelling adds. True love is not to be forced, but must love out of a being's free will. I also understand true love as not loving something perfect, but something imperfect, something difficult to love. It can only realize itself, only come into existence, when it faces opposition. Schelling believes his theory of freedom, spirit, and self-will is supported by evidence from nature, since people act irrationally and in an uncertain contingent way. We create our character through our choices. He explains, in the initial creation, which is nothing other than the birth of light, the dark principle had to be as ground so that the light could be raised out of it. Schelling is here speaking of darkness and light literally, but he also thinks there are secondary higher principles of darkness and light, this time as metaphors for evil and good. Yet the ground itself is neither evil nor good. Evil comes into actuality with the individual human being's choice in favor of the evil principle. Schelling writes, according to idealism, the intelligible being of everything, and especially of man, is outside all causal connectedness, as it is outside or above all time. We act not purely out of cause and effect, the way a determinist will have it. Neither do we act randomly. Determinism and randomness are both contrary to free will. Instead, we determine ourselves from our own inner nature, our own essence. Free is what acts only in accord with its laws of its own being and is determined by nothing else either in or outside itself. The essence of man is fundamentally his own act, writes Schelling. Our self-positing is a primal and fundamental willing, which makes itself into something and is the ground of all ways of being, he adds. According to Schelling, this self-determination happens at the time the person was created, making him who he is from all eternity. He acts in accordance with his will, but his will is determined by his character. His character is from the allowing to act within himself of the good and evil principles, which is the result of an intelligible act whereby his being and life are determined. This choice that determines a person's character, occurring at the time of a person's creation, runs contrary to the becoming that Schelling spoke of earlier. I will later discuss how this postulate of Schelling's is weak and even unnecessary to his metaphysics. Evil becomes possible when we elevate the selfhood, our ego, to control our will, subordinating our spirit to become a means for our actions. The possibility of evil strives to become real, and a sin, tempting us through false images. Yet evil remains only a possibility until we actualize it through an act. For God to gain spirit, there are two initiating factors, what Schelling calls two beginnings. 1. The yearning of God to give birth to himself, that is the will of the ground. 2. The will of love. The will of the ground is not free, whereas the will of love is. The will of the ground is mostly unconscious and not free, and hence, whatever it wills is geometrically necessary. The will of love is free and conscious. Since God is good, what he decides out of his will of love is moral, and since he is all-powerful, what is decided becomes necessary, but not out of geometric necessity, but moral necessity. There could have been a universe with different laws as decided by God, so the current laws are not geometrically necessary. There was a choice, and God chose the current laws. To Schelling, that there was a choice and God chose in accordance to his will of love is proof that God is a free being. These laws, he writes, are neither entirely necessary nor entirely arbitrary, but rather stand in the middle as laws that are derived from a perfect wisdom which is above all things. Natural law comes from the mind, spirit, and will of God, according to Schelling. Since the ground is independent of God, its dark principle also hence confronts God. However, this source of sadness does not come into actuality in God, since he conquers it in an eternal joy of overcoming. Moreover, this principle of darkness in the ground is not evil itself. Schelling says, evil can always only arise in the innermost will of our own heart and is never accomplished without our own act. Only because the dark principle exists can light have something oppositional to overcome. Without darkness, light has no meaning. Good is dormant if there is no possibility of evil. Good without active selfhood is in itself inactive good, writes Schelling. Whoever has neither the material nor the force in himself to do evil is also not fit for good. For good to be actualized, there must be the possibility of doing the opposite of good. One may, however, wonder why God chose to reveal himself if he foresaw evil. But that is tantamount to saying that in order not to have evil, good should also not exist, or in order that love is not opposed, to not have love at all, throwing the baby out with the proverbial bathwater. It would be to sacrifice the absolutely positive to its opposite. God revealing himself is, according to Schelling, a morally necessary act in which love and goodness overcome absolute inwardness. Thus, if God had not revealed himself for the sake of evil, evil would have triumphed over the good and love. However, why is evil not conquered right from the start? Schelling answers, because God is a life, not merely a being. All life has a destiny, however, and is subject to suffering and becoming. To come to a full realization of himself, God too has to become his being, to unify darkness with light and subordinate both to himself. The will of the ground needs to exist in order for this to happen. For good to be separated from evil, there must be death, until death itself can be conquered with good as triumphant and evil relegated to non-existence in the final victory. Let us consider God's being before the existence of the ground, though Schelling had earlier said that neither ground nor God's being are before each other. He terms this non-ground. In the non-ground, there is no distinction between things in it, no opposition of opposites, and also no identity of opposites. Instead, there is an absolute indifference. This indifference is being separate from all opposition. The non-ground divides itself into two equal beginnings, the ground and love. It divides itself so that life and love and personal existence can exist, for love cannot exist in indifference. Love is the link between being or the non-ground and the ground. Human beings that have freedom are the link of all nature to God. Nature, excluding human beings, is subject to the necessity of natural law. Schelling surmises, only in personality is there life, and all personality rests on a dark ground that indeed must therefore be the ground of cognition as well. Only the understanding develops what is hidden and contained in this ground merely potentially and raises it to actuality. To conclude, in the beginning were God and the ground. Prior to God's self-revelation through the ground, he would have been absolute inwardness, in a state of absolute indifference which has neither good nor evil, neither love nor hate, or for that matter, any activity or life. Then there is the ground, characterized by chaos and darkness. This ground is the ground or basis of all existence, the ground of nature. Because God wants to reveal himself to himself, there arises the yearning to give birth to himself, which he does so through the will of the ground. That is one beginning. The second beginning is the will to love, where God gains his personality, what Schelling also calls spirit. God as spirit, as creator, brings light out of the opposition of the darkness of the ground and wroughs order out of the chaos of the ground. God is now alive and being the perfect being that he is, takes pleasure in other living things. The apex of all living things is human beings, because they also have spirit. Because we have some understanding of God, and because like can only be recognized by like, we must be like God in being free beings. Our freedom comes from the choice between the principles of light and darkness found in the ground. According to Schelling, our individual spirit or character is chosen by us at the time of our creation, effectively determining it henceforth. God in his perfection overcomes the evil and darkness in the ground to become pure goodness and light. Human beings remain, however, with the possibility or choice between good and evil. For there to be light, there must be darkness, and to have good and love, there must be their opposites, evil and hate. Schelling's account of God is developmental, where God becomes and achieves self-understanding through revealing himself through becoming from the ground. Yet he posits that individual human character results from a choice at the beginning of its creation, after which it remains fixed. Death and new birth continually renew the human species, separating good and evil, until the final victory where good conquers evil and death is conquered through love. In this essay, he does not elaborate on how the final victory is to be achieved. It is unclear how death and new birth will lead to the final victory, since the development of the world is not necessarily progressive. Perhaps Schelling presumes an unspoken teleology towards goodness. So as to reach that goal, goodness must journey alongside evil in order to finally conquer it. Even so, Schelling's postulate of how individual human beings only make one choice on their character at their individual beginnings, after which they are unable to change, is unsupported by the rest of his theory, at least in the Freedom essay. Allowing for the development of individual character throughout the life of a person is more consistent with a developmental process metaphysics, a process of learning the harm of evil through experience and then changing towards the good is more helpful towards the final victory, rather than the one-and-done nature of human choice of character, especially since that choice seems to be made at an early stage of life, where we are unable to reason or have time to develop a moral conscience. Hence, his postulate weakens his theory. Nonetheless, Schelling's metaphysics of a primal ground independent from God's being, which contains the principles of good and evil, for the good to require the possibility of its contrary in order to become actual, which does require freedom for goodness to be truly good, meets his goal to resolve the problem of evil and explains why human beings require free will. Evil is a necessary correlate if there is to be goodness. However, evil is not created by God. It is fundamental in the ground of nature, which is in God, but yet is independent of God. If God eliminates the ground, He will also eliminate His becoming, His self-revelation. If He eliminates evil, He will also eliminate true love and goodness. For there to be true love and goodness, conscious beings require the genuine possibility to also be hateful and bad, and hence they must have free will. Thank you for listening to the Philosophical Bachelor.